Welcome to Whispers of the Night. Tonight we journey to the cliffs of Cornwall in October 1932, where within the walls of Greyhaven Manor, a shipping magnate lies dead at the foot of a magnificent oak staircase. Stay with me until the very end, for this mystery reveals not just murder, but a clever trap hidden within a beautiful staircase, where trust turns deadly, and the most unlikely person becomes a killer. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing to the channel. You can also join our membership for ad-free videos and exclusive mysteries. Before we begin, tell us, in the comments, where you're listening from. Reading your comments always bring me joy. Now, settle in with a hot cup of coffee, stay curious, and let's get started. The Killer Staircase. Chapter 1. The House on the Cliff. The October wind from the Atlantic struck Greyhaven Manor with relentless fury, sending salt spray across the ancient stones and rattling the diamond-paned windows like skeletal fingers against glass. Hercule Poirot drew his overcoat closer about his small frame as he stepped from the motor car, his green eyes surveying the imposing structure that clung to the Cornish cliffs with what seemed like desperate determination. A most dramatic setting, Inspector observed Poirot, to the tall, weather-beaten man beside him. One might say that nature herself has conspired to create the perfect backdrop for tragedy. Inspector Kelsey of the Cornwall Constabulary shifted uncomfortably, his weathered face creased with worry lines that had deepened considerably since receiving Poirot's telegram 2 days prior. "That's just it, Mr. Poirot. This whole business has me rattled, and that's the truth of it. 23 years on the force, and I've seen my share of accidents. But this one," he shook his grizzled head. "Something doesn't sit right." The manor loomed before them, its Gothic revival architecture casting long shadows even in the pale morning light. Ivy clung to the grey stone walls with tenacious grip, while gargoyles perched at the corners seemed to lure down at the approaching visitors with malevolent amusement. The building itself appeared to have grown from the very cliff face, its foundations disappearing into the rocky precipice that dropped away to the churning sea below. "Sir Leonard Arkwright was found at dawn yesterday," Kelsey continued as they approached the imposing front entrance. "At the foot of what they call the hollow stair, broke his neck in the fall. Poor devil." Poirot paused at the threshold, his small hands adjusting his gloves with characteristic precision. "And yet you summoned me, mon ami. Surely a tragic fall down the stairs, while regrettable, does not require the services of Hercule Poirot." "That's just it, sir. The more I think about it, the more questions arise. Why did no one hear him fall? That staircase echoes something fierce. You'll hear it yourself soon enough. And there are other things, little details that don't quite fit." The heavy oak door swung open before they could knock, revealing a pale woman in her mid-30s with prematurely grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her dark dress and white apron identified her immediately as household staff, though her bearing suggested education above her station. "Inspector Kelsey," she said quietly, her voice carrying the refined tones of Gentile upbringing, despite her obvious distress. "We've been expecting you. This is Clara Wynne, Sir Leonard's governess," Kelsey explained to Poirot. "She found the body." "Miss Wynne," Poirot inclined his head courteously. "I am Hercule Poirot. I offer my condolences on this tragic occurrence." Clara Wynne's pale blue eyes studied the famous detective with curious intensity. "You're very kind, Mr. Poirot. Please come in. Lady Elena is waiting in the morning room." They stepped into the entrance hall, and Poirot felt his breath catch slightly. The space soared upward for 3 stories, but it was dominated entirely by the magnificent staircase that curved gracefully from the marble floor to the galleries above. Carved from what appeared to be a single enormous oak, the stairs seemed to glow with their own inner light, despite the gloom of the October morning. Each step was perfectly proportioned, rising in elegant curves that seemed to float unsupported in the vast space. "The hollow stair," Clara Wynne said softly, following Poirot's gaze. "They say it was carved from a tree that stood here for 600 years before the manor was built. Legend claims it's hollow inside. That's why it echoes so strangely when you walk upon it." As if to demonstrate, she took a single step onto the first oak plank. The sound that emerged was indeed unusual, not the solid thump one might expect, but a resonant, almost musical note that seemed to hang in the air far longer than natural. Poirot's keen eyes noted every detail, the way the morning light fell across the polished wood, the intricate carving work that decorated the banister, and most particularly the area near the base of the staircase, where chalk marks indicated the position in which Sir Leonard Arkwright's body had been found. "Most interesting," he murmured, approaching the staircase with the reverent care of a connoisseur examining a work of art. "And Sir Leonard fell from which landing?" "The first gallery," Clara replied, pointing upward. "At least that's what we assume. He was found here at the base, and his injuries were consistent with such a fall." Poirot knelt beside the chalk outline, his practiced eye taking in details that others might have missed. The position suggested the body had fallen face first, yet there was something about the arrangement that struck him as almost too perfect, too precisely placed. "Inspector," he said quietly, "you mentioned that no one heard the fall. In a house of this size, with servants, family members, and guests, surely someone—" "That's exactly what troubles me, Mr. Poirot." Kelsey's voice dropped to match the detective's subdued tone. "The governess here rises early. Found him at dawn, but between the time he was last seen alive and then nothing. Not a sound. A new voice, cultured and controlled, cut through the morning air from the doorway, leading deeper into the house. Perhaps, gentlemen, we might continue this discussion somewhere more comfortable than beside the scene of my husband's death." Lady Elelena Arkwright stood framed in the doorway like a portrait come to life, tall and elegant with silver-streaked dark hair arranged in perfect waves. She wore her widow's weeds with the same natural grace with which she might have worn a ball gown. Her grey eyes, Poirot noted, held depths that suggested intelligence far above the ordinary, though they remained dry of tears. "Lady Elelena," Poirot said, rising to his feet and bowing slightly, "I am deeply sorry for your loss, madame. I am Hercule Poirot. Mr. Poirot, your reputation precedes you." She moved forward with measured steps, her gaze never leaving the famous detective's face. "I confess I am somewhat surprised to find you here. Surely my husband's death, tragic though it was, requires no investigation beyond what Inspector Kelsey has already conducted." There was something in her tone, perfectly controlled, perfectly appropriate, yet somehow lacking the raw grief one might expect from a newly bereaved widow. Poirot filed this observation away with the precision of a librarian cataloguing a particularly interesting volume. "Madame is most gracious," he replied diplomatically. Yet Inspector Kelsey felt that certain irregularities might benefit from a fresh perspective. The wind chose that moment to howl around the manor with renewed fury, and somewhere in the depths of the house a door slammed with sufficient force to make the crystal chandelier above the hollow stair tremble and sink. The sound seemed to emphasize the isolation of their position, perched as they were on the edge of England itself, with nothing but storm, tossed sea between them and the vastness of the Atlantic. Lady Elelena's composure remained unshaken by the atmospheric drama. "Very well," she said calmly, "though I fear you will find little here to tax your considerable abilities, Mr. Poirot. Sometimes a tragedy is simply that, a tragedy with no sinister purpose lurking beneath the surface." As she spoke these words, Poirot caught the faintest whiff of something incongruous in the salt-tinged air of the entrance hall, the sharp, clean scent of mechanical oil, fresh and out of place in the ancient stone and oak environment. His nostrils twitched almost imperceptibly, and his green eyes sharpened with the first hint of the hunter's instinct that had made him famous throughout Europe. Chapter 2. Secrets in the Salt Air. The morning room of Greyhaven Manor faced inland, away from the relentless assault of wind and spray. Yet even here the storm's presence made itself felt through the subtle rattling of window frames and the occasional moan of air through hidden gaps in the ancient stonework. Poirot settled himself in a chair that afforded him an excellent view of both Lady Elelana and the doorway, his small hands folded precisely over the head of his walking stick. Lady Elelana had arranged herself behind a mahogany writing desk, with the unconscious grace of one accustomed to receiving visitors in circumstances both pleasant and otherwise. She poured tea from an elegant silver service, her movements controlled and deliberate, though Poirot's sharp eyes detected the faintest tremor in her fingers as she lifted the delicate china cup. "You must forgive the household's disarray, Mr. Poirot," she said, offering him a cup with milk prepared exactly as he preferred, a small detail that suggested she had made inquiries about his habits. "As you might imagine, Leonard's death has left us all somewhat unsettled. But of course, madame, such a tragedy must naturally disturb the equilibrium of any household." Pooh accepted the tea, with a slight nod. "Perhaps you would be so kind as to tell me about the evening of your husband's death. Even the smallest detail may prove significant." Lady Eleanor's grey eyes remained steady as she considered his request. "There is very little to tell, I'm afraid." Leonard dined alone. He had been taking his meals separately of late, claiming his digestion required solitude. "I retired early with one of my headaches. The October storms always affect me most adversely. At what time did you retire, if you please?" "Shortly after 9. I took a dose of laudanum for the pain, and slept deeply until Clarara's screams woke me at dawn." She paused, her cup halfway to her lips. Leonard had been, difficult these past months. Suspicious of everyone, secretive about his business affairs. He had new locks installed throughout the house, and took to carrying the keys himself. Poirot's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. "Suspicious, madame? Of what nature were these suspicions?" "He seemed to believe that someone was plotting against him, business rivals," he claimed, though he would never specify which ones or what form this plotting might take. Lady Eleanor's voice carried a note of weary exasperation. He spoke of modernization as though it were a personal attack upon his character. Poor Martin bore the brunt of his displeasure in that regard. Martin, my husband's nephew, Martin Hale. He worked in Leonard's shipping business and had some rather progressive ideas about expansion and efficiency. Leonard took these suggestions as criticism of his methods. She set down her teacup with careful precision. 3 weeks ago, Leonard struck Martin from his will entirely, following a particularly heated disagreement. The door opened at that moment to admit a young man of perhaps 28, his dark hair dishevelled by the wind, and his clothes bearing the telltale dampness of someone who had been walking outdoors despite the weather. His resemblance to the late Sir Leonard was unmistakable in the strong jaw and prominent nose, though his eyes held a restless energy that suggested a more volatile temperament than his uncle had possessed. "Aunt Elena, He stopped short upon seeing Poirot, his expression shifting from surprise to weariness in the span of a heartbeat. "I beg your pardon. I didn't realize you had company, Martha. This is Mr. Hercule Poirot. Inspector Kelsey has asked him to review the circumstances of your uncle's death." Lady Eleanor's introduction carried the slightest emphasis on the word review, as though she found the necessity distasteful. Martin Hale's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His face flushed and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Review? What is there to review?" Uncle Leonard fell down the bloody stairs. Pardon my language. Aunt Eleanor, and broke his neck. It's tragic, but it's hardly mysterious. Poirot studied the young man with the calm attention of a naturalist observing a particularly interesting specimen. "You seem quite certain of the facts, monsieur." "I am certain because they're obvious to anyone with eyes to see." Martin's voice rose with each word. "My uncle was 63 years old, had been drinking port with dinner, and was wondering about that great barn of a house in the dark. The hollow stair has been a death trap since the day it was carved. I'm only surprised this didn't happen sooner. Martin, please." Lady Eleanor's tone carried gentle reproof. "Mr. But Poirot is merely being thorough." "Thorough about what? About finding someone to blame for an accident?" Martin turned back to Poirot, his eyes blazing. "If you must know, I was in London when my uncle died. I have witnesses, receipts, hotel records, whatever you require to prove. I was nowhere near Cornwall when the old man took his tumble." The vehemence of his denial interested Poirot far more than a simple statement of fact might have done. "But of course, Monsieur, Inspector Kelsey will naturally verify all such details. It is, as you say, Merely Thoroges. Martin seemed to realize that his outburst had perhaps revealed more than he intended. He ran a hand through his dishevelled hair and managed a sheepish smile. "Forgive me, Mr. Oro. This whole business has left me rather on edge. Losing Uncle Leonard is bad enough without having to defend myself against implications of, well, of something more sinister than mere accident. There are no implications, I'm sure, merely questions that must be asked." Poirot's tone remained mild, though his eyes missed nothing of the young man's agitation. "You mentioned that the staircase was dangerous. Had there been previous incidents?" Lady Ella Lenena answered before Martin could respond. "The servants have always been cautious about it, particularly at night. The echo makes it difficult to judge one's footing in the dark, and the oak becomes slippery when the sea air brings moisture through the windows. Yet your husband chose to descend it alone in the darkness." "Leonard was not a man to be deterred by inconvenience," she replied. "If he wished to go somewhere in his own house, he went, regardless of the hour or conditions." Poirot rose from his chair and moved to the window where he could observe the entrance hall through the open doorway. The hollow stair gleamed in the grey morning light, its polished surface showing no obvious signs of moisture, despite the storm's fury outside. His practiced eye noted several details that warranted closer examination: tiny scratches in the wood grain that seemed too precise to be natural wear, and most particularly the way certain sections of the staircase seemed to reflect light differently than others. "You mentioned, Lady Ella Lenena, that your husband had been secretive about his business affairs. Did this extend to his personal correspondence?" Leonard had always been private about such matters, but recently she hesitated, glancing at Martin with an expression Poirot could not quite decipher. Recently, he had taken to burning papers in the library fireplace almost nightly. When I asked about it, he claimed he was merely disposing of old documents, but the frequency seemed excessive. Martin shifted uncomfortably. Uncle Leonard had become obsessed with the idea that someone was stealing his business secrets. He accused me of sharing information with competitors, though I never did anything of the sort. As Poirot prepared to ask another question, the distinctive sound of footsteps on the hollow stair drew their attention. The resonant, almost musical notes seemed to carry a different quality now, not the single clear tone Clarowin had produced, but rather a series of subtly varying pitches that suggested the person ascending was testing each step carefully. Through the doorway, they could see Dr. Miles Penbury climbing toward the first landing, his medical bag in one hand and his other trailing along the carved banister for support. His movements were deliberate but unsteady, and when he reached the top, he paused to wipe perspiration from his brow, despite the October chill that permeated the manor. The sound of his descent was equally careful, each step producing its own unique note in the symphony of echoes that gave the staircase its name. As he approached the morning room, Poirot observed that the doctor's face bore the telltale signs of a man under considerable strain: hollow cheeks, shadowed eyes, and a slight tremor in his hands that extended beyond what his recent exertion might explain. Chapter 3. The Governess's Tale, Doctor. Miles Penbury entered the morning room with the measured gait of a man who had learned to mask physical discomfort behind professional composure. His medical bag, worn leather polished smooth by years of service, bore the initials MP in faded gold lettering, a reminder of more prosperous times when such details mattered to his practice. Poirot noted immediately that the doctor's usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, his collar slightly askew, a small stain on his waistcoat, and those trembling hands that seemed to have developed a life of their own. Lady Ella Lenena, Mr. Hale. The doctor nodded to each in turn before his gaze settled on Poirot with undisguised curiosity. "And you must be the famous detective Inspector Kelsey mentioned, Dr. Miles Penbury at your service, Hercule Poirot." The detective rose and offered a slight bow. "Dr. Penbury, I understand you examined Sir Leonard's body and determined the cause of death." "Indeed, a straightforward case, I'm afraid. Cervical fracture consistent with a fall from considerable height. The angle of impact suggests he fell face first, though mercifully death would have been instantaneous. Doctor," Penbury's clinical tone faltered slightly as he continued, Leonard was a good friend as well as a patient. His loss is considerable." Lady Eleanor gestured toward an empty chair. "Please, Miles, sit down. You look quite done in." "Thank you." "No, I cannot stay long. Mrs. Blackwood's rheumatism requires attention this morning." He declined the offered seat, but accepted a cup of tea with hands that betrayed his nervous state by their slight tremor. "I merely wish to assure myself that you were managing well under the circumstances." Poirot observed this exchange with the detached interest of a chess master studying an opponent's opening moves. "Dr. Penry, if you would permit, I have some questions about your examination of Sir Leonard. Of course, though I fear there is little to add to my initial assessment. You mentioned that Sir Leonard fell face first, yet there were no corresponding facial injuries. This struck me as somewhat curious." Dr. Penbury's teacup rattled against its saucer as he set it down with more force than necessary. "Well, that is to say, the primary impact was to the neck, you understand. The face, while it may have struck the marble floor, showed only minor abrasions, nothing inconsistent with such a fall." "Ah," Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest. "And you examined the body where it was found?" "Yes, naturally. Clara summoned me immediately upon finding Leonard. At the mention of her name, Clara appeared in the doorway as though she had been waiting just outside for the conversation to turn in her direction. Her pale complexion had acquired a slight flush, and her dark dress seemed to emphasize the shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and recent tears. "Forgive the intrusion," she said quietly, "but I thought you might wish to speak with me, Mr. Poirot. About finding Sir Leonard, I mean. But certainly, mademoiselle, your account would be most valuable." Poirot gestured toward a chair near the window. "Please make yourself comfortable." Clara seated herself with the careful precision of someone who had spent years managing the behavior of others. Governess, Poirot reflected, being a profession that demanded constant awareness of propriety and place. Her hands, he noticed, bore small calluses that suggested activities beyond the usual duties of supervising a child's education. "I rise early by habit," she began, her voice steady despite the obvious emotion beneath the surface. Young Millicent, Sir Leonard's grand niece, had been having nightmares about the hollow man in the stair, as she called it. Children's fancies, of course, but they were disturbing her sleep. The hollow man. Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. A child's interpretation of the sounds the staircase makes at night. When the wind blows through the gaps in the stonework, it can create quite eerie noises. I thought perhaps Sir Leonard had left reading materials in the library that might help soothe her fears, stories about the manor's history, or some such thing. Lady Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful. Leonard had indeed been spending considerable time in the library recently, often until very late. I assumed it was business correspondence, but perhaps, instead, Clara continued, her voice growing softer, I found him at the base of the stair. He was lying. She paused, pressing a handkerchief to her eyes. He was positioned just below the 5th step from the bottom. I knew immediately that he was beyond help, but I called for Dr. Penbury nonetheless. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "You say the 5th step, mademoiselle. You are quite certain of this detail?" "Yes, absolutely." The morning light was falling directly across that section of the staircase, and Sir Leonard's head was precisely aligned with the edge of that particular step. Her certainty was remarkable, Poirot thought. For someone who claimed to have approached the scene in distress and poor lighting, Dr. Penbury shifted uncomfortably. Clara has always been remarkably observant. Her description matches my own recollection of the scene exactly, and the time of discovery, just past dawn, perhaps 6:30 inches the morning. I had intended to prepare Millicent's breakfast early, as she had been restless during the night. Clara's hands twisted the handkerchief into a tight spiral. Sir Leonard's pocket watch had stopped at 11:47, which we assumed marked the time of his accident. Martin Hale, who had remained silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Clara, you mentioned approaching from the library. But doesn't your usual route to the kitchen take you past the main staircase from the opposite direction?" The governess's flush deepened. Yes, ordinarily, but as I explained, I was checking the library first for materials that might help Millicent sleep better. Poirot filed away this small discrepancy with the methodical precision that had made him famous throughout Europe. Miss Wynne, in your years at Greyhaven Manor, had you observed Sir Leonard walking about the house at night with any regularity? Oh, yes. Leonard was quite the night owl, Lady Elena answered before Clara could respond. Particularly in recent months, he seemed to suffer from insomnia. I often heard him moving about the corridors at all hours, and on the night he died, did you hear such sounds? Clara shook her head. Nothing unusual, but then I had taken a sleeping draught myself, just a mild preparation Dr. Penbury had given me for my own restlessness. The strain of Millicent nightmares had been affecting my sleep as well. Dr. Penbury nodded confirmation. A simple tincture of valerian and chamomile, nothing that would have prevented her from waking if there had been any significant disturbance. Yet the fall itself produced no sound that anyone heard. Poirot mused. Most curious, considering the acoustic properties of the staircase. The storm was particularly fierce that night, Lady Eleanor offered. Perhaps the wind masked any sound. Perhaps. Poirot rose and moved to the window, where he could observe the entrance hall once more. The chalk outline marking where Sir Leonard's body had been discovered was clearly visible from this angle, and something about its position continued to trouble him. Miss Wynne, when you discovered the body, did you disturb its position in any way before Dr. Penbury arrived? I may have knelt beside him briefly to check for signs of life, you understand, but I was careful not to move him, and you summoned Dr. Penbury immediately. Well, not immediately. First, I sent word to Lady Elena, and then I dispatched young Tom, the stable boy, to fetch the doctor. Dr. Penbury arrived perhaps 20 minutes after my discovery. Dr. Penbury cleared his throat nervously. I came as quickly as possible, of course, though I must admit the shock of seeing poor Leonard in such a state rather affected my usual professional composure. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, carrying with it implications that none of them seemed prepared to address directly. Poirot's sharp eyes had not missed the meaningful glances exchanged between Clara and the doctor, nor the way both seemed to avoid looking directly at Lady Elena during certain portions of their testimony. As if sensing the growing tension in the room, the wind outside chose that moment to intensify its assault on the manor, sending a fresh spray of salt water against the windows, and causing the ancient timbers to creak and settle with sounds that might, to a frightened child, indeed resemble the movements of some hollow creature dwelling within the very bones of the house. Chapter 4. The nephew's ambition. After Dr. Penbury had departed for his rounds, and Clara Wynne had excused herself to attend to young Millicent's morning lessons, Poirot found himself alone with Lady Elena and Martin Hale in the gradually warming morning room. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, and the constant percussion of wind and rain against the windows created an oddly intimate atmosphere that seemed to encourage confidences, or perhaps confessions. Martin had positioned himself near the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose that might have appeared casual to a less observant eye than Poirot. The detective noted, however, the rigid tension in the young man's shoulders and the way his gaze kept drifting toward the doorway, as though he were calculating the distance to a potential escape route. "Moo Hale," Poirot began, settling back into his chair with deliberate comfort. "Perhaps you would be so kind as to tell me about your relationship with your late uncle. Lady Elena has mentioned that there were disagreements regarding business matters." Martin's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "Disagreements. That's rather like calling the Battle of Waterloo a minor skirmish." He moved away from the fireplace, his restless energy evident in every step. Uncle Leonard belonged to the old school of commerce, the sort that believes tradition trumps efficiency and that foreign investment is tantamount to treason against the crown. And you held different views. I held modern views, Mr. Poirot. The shipping industry has changed dramatically since the war. Steam has given way to diesel. Cargo handling has been revolutionized, and the Americans have developed techniques that could increase our efficiency by 30% or more. Martin's voice grew passionate as he spoke, his earlier nervousness temporarily forgotten, but Uncle Leonard refused to consider any proposal that involved what he called foreign entanglements. Lady Eleanor observed this exchange with an expression that Poirot found difficult to interpret. There was sadness there, certainly, but also something that might have been calculation. Martha had prepared quite comprehensive plans for modernizing the business, she said quietly. Leonard dismissed them without proper consideration. More than dismissed them, he accused me of being disloyal, of attempting to sell the family heritage to the highest bidder. Martin's face flushed with remembered anger. When I persisted in trying to make him understand the economic realities, he struck me from his will entirely. 28 years of being groomed as his heir, and he cast me aside as though I was some stranger who had wandered in off the street. Pooh's green eyes sharpened with interest. This occurred 3 weeks ago, I understand. Can you recall the specific circumstances that precipitated such a drastic action? Martin glanced at Lady Eleanor, who nodded almost imperceptibly. We had gathered in Uncle Leonard's study after dinner to discuss a proposal from an American shipping concern, Morrison and Associates of New York. They were interested in forming a partnership that would have given us access to their cargo handling innovations while providing them with established European routes. A mutually beneficial arrangement, one might assume, precisely what I thought. The financial projections were extremely favorable, and the Americans had agreed to retain all existing British employees while providing additional training in their methods. Martin moved to the window, staring out at the storm-lashed cliffs, but Uncle Leonard became absolutely furious when he learned that I had been corresponding with Morrison's representatives without his knowledge. You had conducted these negotiations independently. I had made preliminary inquiries only. Nothing had been committed, no agreement signed. I simply wanted to present him with a complete picture of the possibilities before bringing the matter to his attention. Martin's reflection in the rain-streaked glass looked haggarded. Instead, he accused me of betraying the family trust and ordered me to leave his house immediately. Lady Eleanor leaned forward slightly. Leonard could be quite dramatic when he felt his authority was being challenged. In calmer moments, I believe he might have reconsidered his decision. But there were no calmer moments, were there? Martin turned back to face the room. He refused to see me, refused to take my telephone calls, and instructed his solicitor to prepare a new will that very week. Poirot steepled his fingers beneath his chin. This must have placed you in a rather difficult position financially. The question struck home with visible impact. Martin's composure, already strained, showed signs of cracking entirely. I had assumed that my eventual inheritance was secure. Perhaps I had been somewhat cavalier in my personal expenditures, knowing that Uncle Leonard's estate would eventually— He trailed off, the implications clear. You had incurred debts based upon expectations that were suddenly no longer valid. Substantial debt in the admission seemed to pain him physically. My London lodgings, my membership at the club, certain investments that had not yet matured. Without Uncle Leonard's support or the prospect of inheritance, I was facing financial ruin within a matter of months. Lady Eleanor's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. Martin, you never told me the extent of your difficulties. What would have been the point? Uncle Leonard had made his position clear, and I was too proud to come begging for assistance. Martin returned to the fireplace, his shoulders sagging with the weight of confession. I had written to him the night before his death, asking for one final meeting to discuss the situation. I was prepared to apologize, to abandon the American proposal entirely if necessary. And did he respond to this letter? I never received a reply. When I learned of his death, I assumed— Martin's voice grew thick with emotion. I assumed he had died thinking the worst of me. Poirot made a mental note to inquire about this correspondence with Inspector Kelsey. You mentioned that you were in London on the night of your uncle's death. Perhaps you could provide some details of your whereabouts. I was staying at the Savoy Room 347. I can provide you with receipts for meals, theatre tickets, even the taxi fare from Paddington Station when I arrived from Cornwall the previous afternoon. Martin's response came with the practiced precision of someone who had already anticipated this line of questioning. I attended a performance of The Importance of Being Earnest at the Haymarket Theatre that evening, and returned to the hotel shortly after 11. And you remained there until when? Until I received Lady Ellerlana's telegram the following afternoon, informing me of Uncle Leonard's death. I caught the first available train back to Cornwall, and arrived yesterday evening. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Most thorough, monsieur. However, I am curious about one detail. You returned from Cornwall the afternoon before your uncle's death. Had you been visiting Greyhaven Manor? Martin's face wrined. I had hoped to speak with Uncle Leonard personally about my letter, but he refused to see me. I waited in the village for several hours, hoping he might reconsider, but eventually gave up and took the afternoon train to London. And during this visit to the area, did you encounter any other members of the household? I saw Constable Harrington making his rounds. We exchanged pleasantries, and he mentioned that Uncle Leonard had been particularly concerned about security lately, having all the locks changed, insisting on personally checking the grounds each evening. Martin paused, frowning. Now that I think of it, Harrington seemed rather nervous when he mentioned it, though I assumed at the time it was simply his usual deference to the family. This detail about Constable Harrington's behavior struck Poirot as potentially significant. Another small piece in what was clearly becoming a complex puzzle, the young policeman's nervousness during their earlier conversation now took on additional meaning when viewed in conjunction with Martin's observation. Through the morning-room windows, Poirot could see a figure moving across the storm-swept grounds. Constable Harrington himself making his way toward the manor's front entrance with obvious difficulty against the driving rain. His uniform was soaked through, and his usual confident bearing had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like dread. Chapter 5. Midnight Visitors. Constable Harrington's entrance into Greyhaven Manor was accompanied by a gust of wind, so fierce that it sent papers flying from Lady Ellerlana's writing desk, and caused the fire in the morning-room grate to flicker dangerously. The young policeman stood dripping in the doorway, his usually neat uniform plastered to his frame, and his face bearing the unmistakable expression of a man who had been wrestling with his conscience and losing. "Begging your pardon, my lady," he said, removing his waterlogged cap and clutching it with both hands. "Inspector Kelsey said I should report to Mr. Poirot with any additional information about the night Selenard died." Poirot rose from his chair with cat-like grace, his green eyes fixing upon the constable with an intensity that made the young man shift uncomfortably. "Ah, Constable Harrington, most fortuitous timing. Please come in from this tempest. You appear to have something weighing upon your mind." "Well, sir, that's just it." Harrington glanced nervously at Lady Ellerlana and Martin before returning his attention to Poirot. "There's something I didn't mention yesterday. Something that's been gnawing at me ever since we found Sir Leonard at the foot of those stairs." Lady Ellerlana gestured toward a chair near the fire. "Constable, please sit down before you catch your death. Martin, perhaps you could ask Mrs. Blackwood to bring some hot tea." As Martin departed on this errand, Harrington perched on the edge of the offered chair, leaving small puddles on the Persian carpet beneath his feet. His hands continued to work nervously at his cap, and Poirot noted that the young man's eyes kept darting toward the doorway as though he expected someone to enter and contradict whatever confession he was about to make. "Constable," Poirot said gently, settling back into his own chair, "in my experience, the truth, however uncomfortable, is infinitely preferable to the burden of concealment. Perhaps you would care to share what troubles you." Harrington took a deep breath that seemed to originate from his boots. "The truth is, Mr. W. Poirot, I was at the manor on the night Sir Leonard died, not on my regular patrol route. I was here specifically summoned by a note. The admission hung in the air like smoke, and Poirot could sense Lady Ellerlana's sharp intake of breath, even without turning to look at her. A note, you say? From whom? That's the peculiar part, sir. It appeared to be from Lady Ellerlana, asking me to investigate suspicious sounds near the manor grounds. Said she was concerned about intruders, but didn't want to alarm the household by making a fuss. Harrington reached into his uniform pocket and produced a damp piece of paper. I brought it with me. thinking you might want to examine it." Poirot accepted the note with careful fingers, noting immediately that the paper stock was of high quality, the sort used for personal correspondence by those of refined taste and substantial means. The handwriting was feminine, educated, and bore a superficial resemblance to the samples of Lady Ellerlana's script he had observed on various documents throughout the manor. "Most interesting," he murmured, studying the paper against the light. "And what occurred when you responded to this summons?" "I arrived at approximately 11:15, sir. Made a thorough circuit of the grounds, checking windows and doors, looking for any sign of disturbance. Found nothing whatsoever. No footprints, no evidence of attempted entry, nothing out of the ordinary, save for the storm itself." Lady Eleanor leaned forward, her composure showing the first real cracks since Poirot's arrival. "Constable Harrington, I must tell you that I wrote no such note. I retired early that evening with a severe headache, and took laudanum for the pain. I would have been quite incapable of writing coherent correspondence, much less summoning assistance for concerns I did not harbour." The young policeman's face went pale beneath its windburn. "But, my lady, if you didn't write it, then who?" "Precisely the question that interests me," Poirot interrupted smoothly. "Constable, after finding no evidence of intruders, what did you do?" "I remained on the grounds for perhaps 20 minutes longer, making certain I hadn't missed anything. Then I returned to my regular patrol route, assuming the whole business had been a false alarm. Perhaps Lady Ellerlana had heard something that proved to be merely the storm." Harrington's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "When we found Sir Leonard the next morning, I was too embarrassed to mention that I'd been called out on what seemed to be a wild goose chase. I thought it would make me look foolish." Poirot examined the note more closely, holding it up to catch the firelight. The ink was a standard blue-black variety, applied with what appeared to be a fountain pen of good quality. More interesting still were the subtle variations in pressure and letter formation that suggested someone attempting to disguise their natural hand. "Tell me, Constable, during your investigation of the grounds, did you observe any lights in the manor's windows?" "Yes, sir. There was a light burning in what I believe to be the library ground floor facing the gardens, and another in one of the upper chambers, though I couldn't say which specific room. And these lights remained constant during your observation period." "The library light? Yes. But the upstairs light went out while I was watching, perhaps 10 minutes after my arrival. Martin returned at that moment with Mrs. Blackwood, the manor's housekeeper, who carried a tray laden with fresh tea service, and what appeared to be warm towels for the drenched constable. Mrs. Blackwood was a woman of perhaps 55, with the efficient movements and sharp eyes of someone accustomed to managing a large household's countless details. "Will there be anything else, my lady?" she inquired, her gaze taking in the assembled group with obvious curiosity. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood. That will be all." Lady Ellerlana's dismissal was polite but firm, and the housekeeper departed with a slight curtsy that nonetheless conveyed her disappointment at being excluded from what was clearly becoming a most intriguing conversation. Poirot waited until the woman's footsteps had faded before continuing his questioning. "Constable, I am curious about the timing of events. You arrived at 11 and remained until approximately 11:45. "Yes, sir. That would be accurate. And Sir Leonard's pocket watch stopped at 11:47. Most coincidental. The implication was not lost on anyone present. Martin, who had been pouring tea with admirable steadiness, nearly dropped the delicate china pot. Surely you don't suggest that, Constable Harrington?" "I suggest nothing," Misrally observed. "However, I find it most curious that someone would summon a police constable to investigate non-existent intruders at precisely the time when Sir Leonard was meeting his death inside the manor." Lady Eleanor's face had grown, very pale indeed. "Mr. Poirot, surely you cannot believe that I would forge such a note and then deny writing it." "I believe, madame, that someone possessing considerable knowledge of both your handwriting and your household's routines crafted that note for purposes we have yet to determine." Poirot folded the paper carefully and placed it in his waistcoat pocket. "The question that now presents itself is whether this elaborate deception was designed to provide someone with an alibi, or to ensure that a witness would be present, albeit unknowingly, to establish a precise timeline for the evening's events. The storm outside seemed to intensify at that moment, as though nature itself were responding to the growing tension within the manor's walls. Through the rain-ashed windows, the grounds of Greyhaven Manor appeared dark and forbidding, while inside the carefully maintained civility of the morning room had given way to an atmosphere of mounting suspicion that settled over its occupants like fog creeping in from the restless sea. Chapter 6. The mechanism revealed. The afternoon brought a temporary lull in the storm, though the sky remained the colour of old pewter, and the wind continued to moan through the manor's ancient stones with undiminished persistence. Poirot had spent the better part of an hour examining the hollow stair with the methodical attention of a surgeon studying anatomy, his small figure dwarfed by the magnificent structure, yet somehow commanding in its precision and purpose. Inspector Kelsey arrived at 2, accompanied by a weathered man of perhaps 60, whose callous hands and practical clothing identified him as a craftsman of considerable experience. Tom Whitmore, Kelsey explained, was the finest carpenter and millwright in Cornwall, a man whose knowledge of woodworking techniques spanned both traditional methods and modern innovations. Mr. Whitmore has agreed to examine the staircase, Kelsey announced, his weather-beaten face showing lines of concern that had deepened considerably since the morning. Your telegram suggested there might be more to this structure than meets the eye, Mr. Poirot. Poirot nodded gravely. Indeed, Inspector, I believe we shall find that the hollow stair harbours secrets far more substantial than mere acoustical curiosities. The assembled household had gathered in the entrance hall at Poirot's request, Lady Ella Lanena maintaining her composed dignity despite the obvious strain, Martin pacing restlessly near the great windows, Clara Wynne hovering protectively near the staircase as though her presence might somehow shield it from further scrutiny, and Dr. Penbury fidgeting with his medical bag while casting nervous glances at everyone present. Tom Whitmore approached the staircase with the reverent care of a man who understood that he was examining a masterpiece of craftsmanship. His gnarled fingers traced the carved banister, tested the give of individual planks, and tapped various sections with a small hammer while listening intently to the resulting sounds. "Remarkable piece of work," he murmured, his voice carrying the soft burr of Cornwall. "Oh, this old develops its own character, its own voice, but there's something here." He paused, kneeling to examine a section approximately halfway up the first flight. "Mr. Poirot, if you'd be so kind as to observe this particular area." Poirot joined the craftsman, his keen green eyes following every movement, as Whitmore's experienced hands explored what appeared to be a perfectly normal section of the ancient staircase. To the casual observer, nothing distinguished these planks from their neighbours. The same rich patina, the same subtle wear patterns, the same elegant proportions that had made the hollow stair famous throughout the county. "The wood grain here," Whitmore explained, running his fingers along edges invisible to untrained eyes. "It's been cut and rejoined. Recent work, too, within the last few months. I say, someone with considerable skill has modified this section." Lady Eleanor stepped forward, her composure showing the first signs of genuine alarm. "Modified, but that's impossible. The staircase has remained unchanged since the manor was built. Begging your pardon, my lady, but someone has been at work here with precision tools and a deep understanding of the original construction." Whitmore produced a thin metal probe from his toolkit and inserted it into what appeared to be a hairline crack in the wood. "There's a mechanism here, counterweights, I judge, and springs designed to support considerable weight while allowing for movement." Dr. Penbury moved closer, his medical training apparently overcoming his nervousness. "What sort of movement?" "The sort that would allow one of these planks to give way under pressure and then spring back into position." Whitmore's voice carried the certainty of long experience. Ingenious work, really. Whoever designed this understood both the original construction and the principles of mechanical engineering. A collective intake of breath from the assembled group greeted this revelation. Martin was the first to find his voice. "Are you suggesting that Uncle Leonard's fall was not accidental?" "I am suggesting," Poirot said carefully, "that we are dealing with a most sophisticated trap, one that required intimate knowledge of both the staircase's construction and Sir Leonard's habits. Clara Wynne pressed a handkerchief to her lips, her face pale as sea foam. But who would have known enough to? An interesting question, Moiselle, one that brings us to another curious discovery. Poirot withdrew from his waistcoat pocket the fragment of paper he had found in the library fireplace the previous day. This partially burned note bearing what appears to be Sir Leonard's handwriting and an appointment time of 11:30. Lady Elena examined the fragment with growing bewilderment. That appears to be Leonard's hand, certainly, but I cannot imagine what appointment he might have arranged at such an hour. Perhaps, Poirot suggested gently, it was not Sir Leonard who arranged the appointment, but rather someone who wished him to believe such an arrangement had been made. Tom Whitmore, meanwhile, had continued his examination of the mechanism. Mr. Poirot, if I might demonstrate how this contraption operates, I'll need something to simulate the weight of a man, perhaps that bag of tools by the door. With careful precision, the craftsman positioned the heavy tool bag on the modified section of staircase. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a sigh, the plank gave way beneath the weight, creating a gap sufficient for the bag to plummet through to the marble floor below. Almost immediately, the spring mechanism engaged, snapping the plank back into its normal position, with such speed that the eye could barely follow the movement. The demonstration's effect on the watchers was profound. Martin stumbled backward as though struck, while Dr. Penbury groped for a chair to support his suddenly unsteady legs. Clara Wynne made a small sound of distress, and even Lady Elena's iron composure cracked visibly. "Wonder," Poirot breathed, though his expression showed satisfaction rather than surprise. "A most elegant solution to a most complex problem." Inspector Kelsey found his voice first. "This proves it was a murder, then. But who could have constructed such a device? Someone with access to the manor, detailed knowledge of the staircase's original construction, and considerable skill in woodworking and mechanical engineering," Poirot replied. "Moreover, someone who understood Sir Leonard's psychology well enough to lure him to this precise spot at the appointed time." Tom Whitmore was examining the mechanism's components with professional interest. The metalwork is first-rate. Precision springs and counterweights all perfectly balanced. The wood joints have been sealed with a modern adhesive that would be invisible once dry. This represents hours of careful preparation and considerable expense. "And the oil," Poirot added thoughtfully. "The faint scent I detected yesterday. Lubricant for the moving parts applied recently to ensure smooth operation." Lady Eleanor sank into the chair. Dr. Penbury had vacated, her face grey with shock. "I cannot believe that someone in this household, someone we trusted." "Ah, but madame," Poirot said softly, "murder most often springs from the soil of trust betrayed. The question that now confronts us is not whether the killer possessed our confidence, but rather what drove them to destroy it so completely." The afternoon light, filtering through the manor's windows, had taken on the peculiar quality that precedes evening, casting long shadows across the entrance hall and lending an even more sinister aspect to the hollow stair. The magnificent structure, revealed now as an instrument of calculated murder, seemed to loom over them all with malevolent presence, its carved surfaces no longer beautiful, but somehow accusatory, as though the ancient oak itself demanded justice for the perversion of its noble purpose. Chapter 7. The Gathering Storm. Evening settled over Greyhaven Manor with the weight of an approaching judgment, the putware sky deepening to charcoal as the October wind continued its relentless assault on the ancient stones. Poirot had requested that the household gather in the library after dinner, a meal that had been consumed in almost complete silence, with each member of the small company lost in their own troubled thoughts. The library itself was a magnificent room, its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that spoke of generations of learning and refinement. A fire crackled in the substantial grate, casting dancing shadows across the Persian rugs and gleaming mahogany furniture. It was here, Poirot reflected, that Sir Leonard had spent his final evenings burning papers with such frequency that even his wife had remarked upon the habit. Lady Eleanor had positioned herself in a wing-backed chair near the fire, her black silk gown making her appear almost spectral in the flickering light. Martin stood restlessly by the tall windows, occasionally peering out at the storm-lashed grounds, as though seeking escape from the mounting tension within. Clara Wynne sat rigidly upright on a small sofa, her hands folded in her lap with such precision that they might have been carved from marble. Dr. Penbury occupied a chair near the door, his medical bag at his feet, and his fingers drumming a nervous tattoo on the armrest. Inspector Kelsey had taken a position near the fireplace where he could observe all present, while Tom Whitmore, his examination of the staircase complete, sat quietly in the corner with the satisfied air of a craftsman whose work had been properly accomplished. Poirot himself stood before the great desk that had been Sir Leonard's private domain, his small figure commanding attention despite his unassuming stature. His green eyes moved systematically from face to face, reading the subtle signs of guilt, fear, and desperate hope that each person displayed in their own particular fashion. "May," he began, his accented voice carrying clearly through the room, "we have before us a most complex puzzle, one that combines technical ingenuity with psychological insight, in a manner that does credit to the criminal mind, however deplorable we may find the ultimate purpose." Lady Eleanor shifted slightly in her chair. "Mr. Poirot, surely after this afternoon's discoveries, the matter is clear enough. Someone entered our home, modified the staircase, and used it to murder my husband. The question now is simply one of identification. Ah, but madame, if only it was so simple." Poirot moved to the desk and picked up a leather-bound ledger that lay open upon its surface. "Your husband kept meticulous records, I observe, financial transactions, business correspondence, personal appointments, all documented, with admirable precision." Dr. Penbury leaned forward anxiously. "What sort of records?" "Records that tell us much about the relationships within this household, the pressures that various individuals faced, and the opportunities that presented themselves for both mischief and murder." Poirot's fingers traced the elegant script that filled the ledger's pages. "For instance, there are payments recorded here to a London gaming establishment, payments made on behalf of someone whose initials are MP." The blood drained from Dr. Penbury's face as though a valve had been opened. "Mr. Poirot, I can explain, but certainly, more. Sir Leonard was most generous in settling your gambling debts, was he not? The amounts recorded here suggest obligations that would have been quite impossible for a country physician to honour from his practice alone." Claren's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence that followed this revelation. Martin turned from his contemplation of the storm to stare at the doctor with undisguised amazement. "Miles," Lady Eleanor said quietly, "I had no idea your difficulties were so extensive." Dr. Penbury seemed to age 10 years in the space of a moment. "Leonard offered to help when he learned of my situation. The gaming debts were substantial. Without his intervention, I would have faced ruin and disgrace. And yet," Poirot continued relentlessly, "the final entry in this particular series of payments is dated just 4 days before Sir Leonard's death. Coincidentally, this corresponds with your last visit to examine him for what you described as routine complaints of insomnia and digestive troubles. What are you suggesting?" "I suggest nothing, merely observe. However, I find it curious that Sir Leonard should have called in these debts at precisely the moment when his own business affairs were facing such strain." Poirot moved to another section of the desk, where a stack of correspondence lay neatly arranged. These letters from Morrison and Associates of New York make fascinating reading. It appears that Sir Leonard was not quite so opposed to American business partnerships as his nephew believed. Martin spun around so quickly that he nearly knocked over a small table. "That's impossible. Uncle Leonard refused to even discuss the Morrison proposal. On the contrary, monsieur, these letters suggest that he had been conducting quite detailed negotiations with the American firm for several months. The terms under discussion were remarkably similar to those in the proposal you presented to him, though with one significant difference. The tension in the room had become almost palpable. Clara's hands had begun to tremble despite her obvious efforts at self-control, while Lady Eleanor sat, so that she might have been holding her breath. The difference, Poirot continued, was that Selenard intended to retain complete control of the partnership, with no provision for his nephew's continued involvement in the business. Indeed, these documents suggest that he planned to use the American investment to buy out Martin's existing stake in the company entirely. Martin's face went white with shock and rage. He was planning to cut me out completely, not just from the inheritance, but from the business as well. It would appear so. The final letter in this correspondence, dated the day before his death, confirms his intention to sign the agreement within the week. Poirot's voice carried a note of sympathy despite the devastating nature of his revelations. Your uncle, it seems, had concluded that your progressive ideas were not wrong, merely premature. He intended to implement them himself without your participation. The silence that followed this announcement was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the continued howling of the wind outside. Each person in the room seemed lost in their own calculations, weighing the implications of what they had learned against their own particular circumstances and secrets. Clara Wynne was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Sir Leonard mentioned nothing of this to me, and I handled much of his correspondence. Ah, but mademoiselle, these particular letters were kept in Sir Leonard's personal safe, along with certain other documents that I believe will prove most illuminating when we examine them tomorrow morning. Poirot's green eyes swept the room once more. Documents that will, I am confident, reveal not only the identity of our murderer, but also the ingenious method by which they gained access to the knowledge necessary to construct their elaborate trap. The detective moved toward the door, pausing only to adjust his coat with characteristic precision. I suggest that we all retire early this evening. Tomorrow will bring revelations that will, I fear, prove most distressing to everyone present. As the small company began to disperse, each lost in their own troubled thoughts, the storm outside seemed to intensify, as though nature herself were preparing for the tempest of human emotion that would surely follow Poirot's promised revelations. Chapter 8. The Hollow Truth. The morning brought no respite from the October storm, though the wind had settled into a steady moan that seemed to harmonize with the hollow resonance of the ancient staircase. Poirot had arranged the final gathering in the entrance hall where the modified oak structure stood like a silent witness to the crime it had been forced to enable. The assembled company formed a semicircle around the base of the stair, each face bearing the particular strain of a sleepless night spent in contemplation of guilt and discovery. Lady Helena maintained her composure with admirable determination, though the dark circles beneath her grey eyes betrayed the cost of her self-control. She had positioned herself where the morning light fell most favorably, as though seeking some small advantage in the ordeal to come. Martin stood beside her, his restless energy finally stilled by the gravity of the moment. Clara Wynne had chosen a spot near the great windows, perhaps finding comfort in the proximity to escape, while Dr. Penbury remained close to the door, his medical bag clutched like a talisman against the approaching revelation. Inspector Kelsey and Tom Whitmore flanked the group, their professional duties requiring them to observe rather than participate in the psychological drama about to unfold. The craftsman's examination had provided the mechanical evidence, but it would be Poirot's understanding of human nature that would complete the picture. "Amy," Poirot began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded attention in drawing rooms and courtrooms across Europe. "We have before us a crime of remarkable sophistication, one that required not only technical skill, but also intimate knowledge of both the victim's habits and the household's routines." He moved to the modified section of the staircase, his small hands tracing the edges of the concealed mechanism with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering an ancient truth. The creation of this trap demanded months of preparation. The criminal needed access to Sir Leonard's architectural surveys, understanding of the staircase's original hollow construction, and the woodworking skills to execute such precise modifications. Lady Eleanor's voice carried a note of defensive pride. "Mr. Poirot, surely you cannot suggest that anyone in this household possessed such specialized knowledge. On the contrary, madame, I suggest that the murderer possessed not only the necessary skills, but also the psychological insight to manipulate their victim with devastating effectiveness." Poirot withdrew the partially burned note from his waistcoat pocket. "This fragment," which initially appeared to be Sir Leonard's handwriting, setting an appointment for 11:30, is actually a clever forgery, one that lured him to this precise spot at the moment when the trap was ready to spring. Dr. Penbury shifted uncomfortably, but surely the handwriting analysis would reveal, mon ami, that while the script bears a superficial resemblance to Selenard's hand, it lacks the subtle characteristics that develop over decades of consistent practice. However, it demonstrates enough skill to deceive its intended victim in poor lighting and under emotional stress. Clara Wynne pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Who could have known Sir Leonard well enough to forge his writing so convincingly? Someone who had handled his correspondence regularly, observed his writing habits, and possessed both the artistic skill and the criminal determination to exploit this knowledge. Poirot's green eyes moved systematically across the assembled faces. Someone who also understood that Sir Leonard's suspicious nature could be used against him, that he would respond to a mysterious late-night appointment with curiosity rather than caution. Martin found his voice with obvious effort. You're describing someone with extraordinary planning ability and complete ruthlessness. Indeed, monsieur, but also someone driven by desperation, by the knowledge that their carefully constructed world was about to collapse entirely. Poirot moved to Lady Eleanor's writing desk, which had been carried into the entrance hall for this final revelation. The documents in Selenard's safe revealed not only his secret negotiations with Morrison and associates, but also his plans to have his wife declared mentally incompetent. The collective gasp that greeted this announcement seemed to echo through the hollow stair itself. Lady Eleanor's composure finally cracked, her face going white as the marble floor beneath her feet. Leonard had discovered certain irregularities in the management of your personal inheritance. Madame, the considerable fortune you brought to your marriage had been used to cover losses in his shipping business, losses that the American partnership was intended to recoup. Poirot's voice carried genuine sympathy despite the devastating nature of his words. Faced with exposure and the loss of everything you had worked to preserve, you conceived a plan of remarkable audacity. This is preposterous, Lady Eleanor said, but her voice lacked its usual strength. Your woodworking workshop provided both the skills and the tools necessary to modify the staircase. Your access to household records gave you the architectural knowledge required. Your position as mistress of the manor allowed you to work undetected during the long hours when Sir Leonard was occupied with his correspondence. Poirot's reconstruction continued with methodical precision. The forged notes, both the one luring Sir Leonard to his death and the one summoning Constable Harrington as an unwitting witness, were written on paper from your husband's own desk, using techniques you had perfected during years of handling his business correspondent. Lady Eleanor straightened in her chair with the dignity of a queen, facing execution. You have no proof of these accusations. On the contrary, madame, your fatal error was your reference to Sir Leonard's death occurring before midnight during our initial conversation. Since his body was not discovered until dawn, and his stopwatch could have been damaged at any time during the fall, no one should have known the actual time of death, except the person who caused it. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind's continued assault on the manor's stones and the subtle creaking of the ancient timbers. Lady Eleanor sat motionless for a long moment, her grey eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the reach of human judgment. Leonard was going to destroy me, she said finally, her voice carrying the hollow resonance of the stair itself. 20 years of marriage, and he was prepared to brand me a madwoman to cover his own failures. The money he had stolen from my inheritance, the business partnerships he had ruined through his obstinate pride, the debts he had hidden, all of it would have been laid at my door while he emerged as the wronged husband, protecting society from his unstable wife. Inspector Kelsey stepped forward with the quiet authority of official duty. Lady Eleanor Arkwright, I arrest you for the murder of your husband, Sir Leonard Arkwright. She rose from her chair with the same graceful composure she had maintained throughout their acquaintance, her dignity intact, even in defeat. I regret only that such measures became necessary. Leonard might have been content with the American partnership and left well enough alone. As Inspector Kelsey led Lady Eleanor away, Poirot remained beside the hollow stair, his small figure dwarfed by the magnificent structure that had been perverted into an instrument of death. The great house seemed to exhale around them, as though releasing a breath it had held too long, and in that moment the detective could hear clearly the sound that had given the staircase its name, not the mere echo of footsteps, but the resonant voice of truth itself, speaking from the hollow heart of human ambition and despair. The storm outside was beginning to abate at last, but Pooh knew that the echoes of this morning's revelations would linger in Greyhaven Manor long after the winds had stilled and the sea had returned to peaceful rhythms. Some secrets once revealed changed forever the character of the places that harbour them, leaving behind only the hollow sound of what might have been. Thank you for joining us for the killer staircase. Did you suspect Lady Eleanor before Poirot revealed the truth? Tell us in the comments. If you like this mystery, please subscribe to Whispers of the Night and consider joining our membership for ad-free listening and exclusive tales. Until next time, this is Alfie signing off from Whispers of the Night.